Good evening.
Good evening.
All right. Welcome to People's University Climate Change. This is part 2 of our 5-part series exploring what can still be done to slow and ultimately reverse climate change. This coming Tuesday, August 22nd at noon, we would like to invite everyone for the official reveal of the beautiful mural upstairs. Artist Von Dalbell will be on hand to unveil, and a time-lapse video will be shown with complimentary food prepared by Table 304. The event will also feature music by Ezra Hamilton. Then on Tuesday, August 29th at 12 p.m., we will have The Beatles, a solo acoustic tribute featuring the troubadour, Bob Gaudio. So Bob will be back. And on Thursday, August 31st at noon the same week, that's Thursday, Mike Florio, nationally known pro football commentator, author of Father of Mine, a mob novel set in Wheeling. We have copies of Mike's book available for $15. Next Thursday, August 24th at 7, in Class 3, we will explore harnessing nature to slow climate change with Dr. Eddie Brostek, Associate Professor, Department of Biology at WVU. Tonight, our series on climate change is part of the Wheeling Reads Project, which encourages the people of our community to read and discuss Jennifer Haig's Heat and Light. We have a festival coming up on Saturday, September 9th, with Jennifer as the keynote speaker. We have workshops on poetry, art, and young adult fiction that day. Do not miss this event. Tonight, we will consider whether forests, trees, will continue to slow climate change in the future. Our instructor this evening is Joanna Ridgeway. She is a Ph.D. candidate working with Dr. Eddie Brostek in the Department of Biology at WVU. Her research focuses on how managed and unmanaged ecosystems sequester carbon and help combat climate change. She received her BS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from West Virginia University and will be completing her doctoral degree in biology at West Virginia University in the fall of this year, 2023. And also, we have People's University tote bags. If you would like one, see us, we will get you one. And now we have Joanna Ridgeway. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to come out today and talk to you guys about my favorite forest ecosystems and how they help slow climate change, as well as how human activities impact the ability of forests to do this important job.
Is that mic really working?
It's on.
I didn't do this to that. There we go. All right. Gonna move it a little closer. Is this good? This good?
Yeah,
all right. So I want to start with just a little bit of a review of what Dr. Peter John's class covered last week, which is what drives climate change. So here we're looking at something called the Keeling curve that maps atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations. We can see it has this wiggle that goes up and down, and that's because of seasons and the distribution of land and seasonal vegetation in the northern hemisphere. So in the summer, when photosynthesis is really going, then the CO2 is dropped down and it goes back up in the winter. And this wiggle is called the breathing of the biosphere. But there's a lot more of an obvious trend in this diagram, which is that these CO2 levels are increasing. This increase is due to human activities. So things like fossil fuel burning and land use change. In pre-industrial CO2 levels were around 280 ppms, and now we're up at around 424 ppms, and that extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is coming from us. And rather than allowing us to keep climbing, it's really important for us to try to flatten and ideally reverse this trend of increasing atmospheric CO2. And now I want to talk a little bit about how this CO2 and carbon cycles on Earth. There are 3 main places that we can find actively cycling carbon: in the atmosphere, and in the land, and in the ocean. Carbon in the atmosphere doesn't just hang around up there. It can get photosynthesized or dissolved in water and aquatic ecosystems, or it can be taken up by photosynthesis in plants and terrestrial ecosystems. And then that carbon is respired back to the atmosphere. So if carbon cycling is hypothetically in equilibrium, then all the carbon flux that's being taken up from the atmosphere by plants would be balanced by the carbon flux that's respired back into the atmosphere. However, we're throwing this cycle out of balance by activities like fossil fuel burning and deforestation that add new carbon emissions into the atmosphere on the scale of about 10 gigatons per year. And let's take a look at where this carbon goes. So in this figure, we have a map of the sources of carbon to the atmosphere on the top, which is positive in this chart, and then there's a zero line, and then there's sinks where that carbon ends up on the bottom, which are negative in this chart, and it goes up until 2020. And so we have this additional carbon that gets thrown into the global carbon cycle from burning fossil fuels, which is in the gray, and from land use change in agriculture, which is in the yellow on top. And on the bottom, that's where this carbon goes. So of course, some of this carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere. That is that light blue. Can you see my mouse? No, you can't. Okay, that's this light blue section down here at the bottom. But some of the accumulation of atmospheric CO2 has been attenuated by increased carbon uptake into terrestrial and marine ecosystems. So those are called the ocean or the land carbon sinks. First up is the ocean carbon sink, that's that dark blue. That's about a third of the carbon dioxide that we emit gets taken up in the oceans. Oceans have a lot of actively cycling carbon and photosynthesis, but the carbon that gets sequestered in the ocean is primarily driven by physical processes where atmospheric CO2 gets dissolved in ocean water. And there's a lot of equilibrium relationships where like more CO2 in the air equals more CO2 in the water. However, this carbon sink is reversible, so if we have less CO2 in the air, we have less CO2 in the water. And also when CO2 dissolves in water, it dissolves as carbonic acid, which has really bad effects like acidifying the ocean and leading to the loss of marine life and habitats. So as a result, my favorite carbon sink is the land carbon sink, which is in green. It accounts for another third of anthropogenic emissions. So here, this is, you can kind of see it sort of increasing over time, and that's like a very important carbon sink that doesn't acidify marine ecosystems. So let's see where on land this carbon is being taken up. Here we're looking at a map of the globe that shows where there is a net carbon uptake into ecosystems, or ecosystems are a net carbon source and where the carbon emissions from that area are leading to a net increase in carbon in the atmosphere. So where there is more green on the map, that's a greater carbon sink. And where there's more purple on the map, that's a greater carbon source. And if we look in particular at North America, we see a lot of this really dark green carbon sink where we have a lot of forests in the eastern US. These forests are doing a super important job of facilitating the land carbon sink and taking up some of those excess emissions that we're putting up into the atmosphere. And so within a forest ecosystem, the potential for a carbon sink is really simple. It's driven by the balance of carbon that goes into the ecosystem through photosynthesis versus the carbon that's lost from the ecosystem through plant and soil respiration. And last week, Dr. Peter John used this analogy with a sink and a drain, so I'm going to kind of follow the same idea. Here, our carbon in, or our photosynthesis, is kind of like a faucet. Our ecosystem carbon pool is like the water that's in the sink. And our carbon out, or our drain, is kind of like respiration leaving your ecosystem. So if we decrease the carbon that comes in, or if we increase the carbon that leaves, we get a decline in this forest carbon pool. And that we make this ecosystem like a net carbon source back to the atmosphere. Or if we can increase photosynthesis as our carbon input, or if we can decrease carbon losses to respiration, then our forest can be a net carbon sink and take up more atmospheric CO2. And so now we're going to head back, hopefully, to middle school maybe, where we're learning about photosynthesis, which is the process by which plants take up CO2 with water and using energy from sunlight to make sugar or organic carbon. Plants also respire about half of the carbon they assimilate back as carbon dioxide, which is this plant respiration arrow on this diagram to the right here, back into the atmosphere. Next up, we have soil respiration. So here, plants, litter inputs like dead roots and dead leaves enter this soil organic matter pool. And they don't just accumulate, right? Like when all the leaves fall on the ground in the fall, we're not walking through 5, 10, 15 feet of dead leaves that have accumulated over years. they get decomposed by soil microbes, who break this organic matter down and who respire carbon back out of the ecosystem, so the soil is effectively breathing. And we have this pretty broad overview of how carbon enters. So it enters through photosynthesis, how it leaves through plant and soil respiration, and how it can build up in a forest ecosystem, in plant biomass, and in the soil. However, it gets really complicated when we try to put some of the numbers and the arrows on these pools and make conclusions about the overall forest carbon sink of the US, because forests are really different in how they function and how much carbon they can store. So in these charts, we're looking at some maps of the US and the distribution of the soil carbon in forests. And it's pretty varied across the country. So on the one on the left, we're looking at the total amount of soil carbon, where green is less soil carbon and red is more soil carbon. And we have a nice little strip of red soil carbon down in the northeast from through the Appalachian Mountain Range. In these red regions that are forest ecosystems, the soil carbon pool is ranging from 80 to 172 megagrams of carbon per hectare. And on the right side, we're looking at uncertainty in these observations of soil carbon for the standard deviation. So here on this side, it is bluer if it's lower, and it's redder if it's higher. And you might see that in these places that have a lot more soil carbon on the left, we also have a lot more uncertainty on the right. And that uncertainty is in the range of 60 to about 150 megagrams of carbon per hectare. So overall, not only is forest soil carbon pretty variable across the US, but our estimates when we try to make these conclusions and put numbers on how much the carbon is storing carbon, or how much forests are storing carbon in the US, can also be really uncertain. And recently there's been a lot of ecological theory where some of this variability in these observations can be attributed to how these forests and why these forests function differently. So in particular today, I'm going to be talking about mycorrhizal fungi. This word mycorrhizae means fungus, root. And so these are symbiotic fungi that form associations with plant roots in the vast majority of land plants. And trees allocate a ton of their carbon, up to 20% of all the carbon they take up, to these fungi in the rhizosphere, which is the zone of soil in the roots. So they send a lot of carbon to the fungi. And in exchange, the fungi increase the plant's ability to acquire nutrients and water from soil. And some of these are a lot more photogenic than others, so some of them have mushrooms that you might see when you're walking around outside, some of them don't. But what's really important are that they have these fungal hyphae that are really fine plant roots that can really increase the amount of soil surface area that these organisms can explore and really increase the tree's access to water and nutrients. And this symbiosis is super important. We actually believe that it is what allowed plants to grow on land in the first place. And today we're going to talk about two main groups of mycorrhizal fungi that are relevant in temperate forests around us. These are arbuscular fungi, or AM fungi, and then ectomycorrhizal fungi, or ECM fungi. And trees in temperate forests generally associate with either AM or ECM fungi. And this leads to differences in how these forests function. So on the left, we're looking at a microscope image of a plant root that's been colonized by AM fungi. So AM fungi grow inside of the roots of plant cells, and that's where they exchange their nutrients and their water that they've taken up from the soil with carbon from the plant. And the AM fungi build a ton of hyphae, like we talked about on the last slide, to kind of scavenge that soil and acquire nutrients. And they're really, really good at getting nutrients in the soil that are accessible or plant available. So like the type of things that you might fertilize your houseplants with, these fungi are super good at getting from the soil. And on the right, we're looking at a plant root that's been colonized by ECM fungi. These form structures that kind of surround plant roots. So here we're looking at like a plant root that has, it looks like little fungal sweaters kind of covering the root tips here. These fungi generally take a lot more carbon from their host trees to build the structures, but they also have an enhanced ability to actively decompose soil organic matter and increase nutrient uptake that might be less plant available. So think more like dead leaves and dead roots, recycling the nitrogen that was in that plant litter compared to fertilizing with something that you could buy at the store is kind of what those fungi are really good at. And while there's some exceptions, trees in the forest around here in West Virginia generally associate with just AM or just ECM fungi. Some common AM fungi-associated trees that you're probably familiar with are things like our maples and our black cherries and our tulip poplars. And then some common trees that associate with ECM fungi are things like our oaks and our pines, and my favorite, which is the eastern hemlock. We could probably go out and find all of these trees here in Wheeling. So we've definitely got both AM and ECM dominated forest stands. And when we look at a broad region across the whole US, here we're looking at a distribution of AM and ECM ecosystems, where ecosystems that are almost completely AM dominated are more purple rather than yellow. And so here in this eastern US, we have a pretty good mix of AM and ECM forests. It's pretty green in the middle there. And then I'm not going to walk through this whole figure, but the main idea is that under ambient conditions, AM forests and ECM forests operate pretty differently. As a quick reminder, like the AM species are the ones that are really good at inorganic nutrients. The ECM systems are better at getting nutrients from organic matter, so they differ in how plants acquire nutrients and how they acquire water to fuel photosynthesis. And they also differ in how the soil carbon is built and how it's retained. So today I want to talk about how using this theory of mycorrhizal associations and how they differ can help us to better understand how forests function and how forests might respond to future climate change. So we know that forest carbon retention depends on the balance of carbon inputs to the ecosystem through photosynthesis and carbon that's lost from the ecosystem through respiration. And human activities have a lot of impacts on things that affect these processes, like water availability and temperature and nutrients and carbon dioxide that can really impact how that forest functions. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to go through these 4 different categories and look at some ecosystem experiments that help us understand what their effect is on forest carbon storage. And then further, we're going to consider if these processes might be different for AM versus ECM associated forests and see if that can help us kind of better understand what's going on. So, I'm going to flash this chart up a lot. It's pretty boring right now, but we're going to kind of fill it in because there's a lot of things that are going on, so we'll keep track of these general effects of drought and temperature and nitrogen availability and CO2 on forest carbon retention, as well as if that's different for AM and ECM forests. So first up, we're going to talk about water availability. Here we're looking at kind of projections for changes in precipitation in different seasons. So on the top left is winter, top right is spring, bottom left is summer, and the bottom right is fall season. And an increase in precipitation is more blue, and decrease in precipitation is more brown. So in general, in our region, we're getting wetter with climate change, especially in winter and spring and fall. But if we look at just the summer, we're actually getting a little bit less precipitation during the growing season, which is going to have a pretty big impact on plants. And further, what we've been seeing is longer periods of drought, punctuated by more intense, shorter periods of rainfall. And we want to take a look at how that will impact trees and their function. So we know that trees need water to photosynthesize, and it makes sense that more drought would lead to a decline in tree growth. So in this talk, Brostek et al., the guy who's talking next week, looked at the growth of different tree species, which are shown in different colors here, and seeing how increasing days of drought, which is on the x-axis, impacts that tree growth, which is on the y-axis. So overall, longer droughts with longer drought days lead to more reduced growth, but there's also a lot of variability across species, where some, like the blue line, has a lot greater decline in growth. Those are tulip poplars, which are AM-associated trees. And others, like this red line, don't decline as much with increasing droughts. They're more resilient to that. And those are ECM-associated oaks in the red. So for the first thing on this chart, we do generally see that drought decreases forest carbon by limiting tree growth. And I showed some evidence with just 2 trees that maybe that could be different with AM and ECM species, where AM trees might be more drought sensitive and ECM trees might be more drought tolerant. We're going to dig into that a little bit more on the next few slides. And I'd like to introduce the work of my colleague, Dr. Nanette Raska. she set up a drought experiment to test this hypothesis that AM and ECM forests would respond differently to drought. So she built these pretty big rainout structures underneath the forest trees. These are like wooden posts and then panels that would catch the rainfall and then funnel it away from the forest in those areas to limit water inputs to the soils in AM versus ECM ecosystems. In this experiment, Nan observed that AM and ECM trees both maintained their growth, but AM trees, which are shown in the red bars here, had to spend more carbon on root biomass to acquire water. So this darker red bar for drought is showing there was more root biomass in the AM plots under drought than under ambient conditions in the light red. But by contrast, there's no difference in the ECM trees in how much carbon they had to send below ground to get water, and those blue bars are not significantly different. And then further, we're looking at some measurements that Nanette made of soil and nitrogen mineralization, which is the process by which soil microbes decompose organic matter to recycle nutrients and recycle nitrogen into a form that's available to fuel plant growth. So in the AM plots on the left, the drought is yellow and the control is blue. And the drought led to a significant decline in this potential in AM systems, whereas there was no significant difference in the ECM systems between the control treatments and the treatment that was being droughted. So that indicates that drought, that drought reduces the ability of these AM-associated trees to acquire nutrients to fuel plant growth, and it makes these trees spend more of their carbon on just getting water because they can't maintain that growth on their own. And so overall, now we're going to say that drought reduces forest carbon, but ECM forests might be a little bit more resilient and can maintain function better than AM trees under drought. And next up is a pretty big one. So here we're going to look at temperature projections of the US. The temperature projections over the next 2 decades are the ones that are shown in yellow, or that's from 2040 to 2060-ish. And then the 2 maps on the right show projections of temperature by the end of the century from 2080 to 2100 about, where redder is hotter. And the top 2 maps are temperature projections under a high emission scenario, and the bottom 2 are a low emission scenario. So here in Wheeling, West Virginia, even if we're following this lower emission scenario and trying to do a good job with cutting emissions and cutting carbon dioxide additions to the atmosphere, we're still in the range of a 5 to 6 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature by the end of the century. And we know that the decisions that we're making now with respect to our emissions and policies will have a big impact on exactly where we end up here, but it seems like an increase in temperature is pretty inevitable because we're already experiencing this. I believe that July 2023 was the hottest month ever, which is unprecedented, but predicted by all these models that we're looking at. So as a result, it's going to be really important to understand how temperature will impact the ability of forests to grow and to retain carbon. And I'm just going to focus on a couple of different things here today within this. There's a lot of ways the temperature can impact forests. So first up, warmer year-round temperatures might lead to earlier springs and later winters. And if any of you guys garden, maybe you've noticed some changes in the timing of when it frosts in the spring for planting. And one way that we kind of track this seasonality or this phenology, which is kind of like the changing of the seasons, is through phenology cameras or the PhenoCam network. So here we have a set space in a forest canopy that's monitored year-round so that we can measure and compare things like when trees start to green up in the spring or when the leaves fall in the fall. And so over the year, we might get data that looks like this. So here we're looking at observed greenness in this forest canopy and over the span of the year. So this is starting at the beginning of January and running over the course of the year. It looks like the trees are greening up around day of year 140 and then dropping back down around day of year 300, which is in October, I believe. And so we can kind of use this to track when forests are growing and how long they can grow for. And generally, a longer growing season means more time for photosynthesis and more carbon inputs to the ecosystem. However, we haven't really dived into factors that are controlling the carbon flux out of forests, which is super temperature sensitive. A major flux of CO2 comes from microbial decomposition of soil organic matter and respiration of this carbon back out of the soils as CO2. So by decomposing the soil organic matter, which is SOM in my diagram, microbes can both mineralize carbon in yellow, and they can also mineralize and increase the availability of nitrogen in purple. And microbes are really temperature sensitive. Decomposition goes a lot more rapidly in warmer temperatures. And I bet you guys are probably all familiar with this because we use refrigerators to slow down decomposition and decay of our food. It's kind of the same thing going on in the forests. And there's some simultaneously occurring processes that might have conflicting effects on forest carbon retention with warming. So on one hand, if we get more decomposition, microbes are recycling more nutrients out of the plant organic matter in the soil, then maybe we're fertilizing trees and we can increase their productivity. But then on the other hand, the accelerated microbial decomposition can also really enhance soil forest carbon losses. And here we're looking at results from experiments where the increase in soil temperature on this x-axis has a really significant impact on CO2 production by microbes on the y-axis that gets steeper with hotter temperatures. So hotter temperatures can really accelerate this carbon loss from ecosystems. And to look at these impacts in the field and in the forest, ecosystem experiments have been performed where the whole soil profile is warmed in forest plots over multiple years. And the scientists in this project looked at the carbon increases in vegetation from this warming, as well as the soil organic matter decay. So in this figure, we've got some carbon increases if it's above this zero line on the y-axis, and then carbon losses, which will be below the zero line on the y-axis, and then for 7 years. The increases in vegetation are white, so with the soil warming, plants increase their growth and increase their productivity and increased carbon flux into the ecosystem. But on the bottom, these gray bars show that soil warming led to a pretty consistent loss of soil carbon from this ecosystem. And in the total overall sum of that, the total ecosystem carbon flux is shown in these black bars, which are also a carbon loss. So the losses from the soil outweighed the gains from more plant growth with this experiment. So back to this chart, overall, this evidence generally suggests that hotter temperatures lead to a loss of forest carbon. And when we look at differences between AM and ECM dominated systems, we see that these forests respond differently to temperature. So here we're looking at the effect of warming on plants, which are blue, and soils, which are red, for AM and ECM associated forests. So AM is on the left and ECM is on the right. Warming tends to have a lot more positive effect on the growth of AM-associated trees. So those are things like your maples and your tulip poplars can grow a lot more when it's hotter. But it has a more negative effect or leads to more soil carbon losses for soils in those AM systems. So it stimulates decomposition and more microbial respiration compared with ECM forests, which just sort of increase a little bit. So overall, when you balance those carbon losses and gains in AM systems, it seems to be pretty proportionate to ECM systems. So they have maybe a similar net effect, even though they're pretty different in how those forests function to changes in temperature. Next, we're going to look at nitrogen deposition. So we've mostly focused on carbon, but humans have had a really massive impact on the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is really important because it's a key nutrient that constrains plant productivity. And we have a ton of nitrogen on Earth, but most of it is inert, like nitrogen gas in the air. So it's not reactive, it's not plant available, we can't really take advantage of this nitrogen directly. But human activities like synthesizing fertilizer for agriculture and burning fossil fuels have increased the cycling of reactive nitrogen that is plant available. It was roughly 50 teragrams of nitrogen per year before the Industrial Revolution, and now it's up around 300. So that's like 6 times as much nitrogen is on Earth right now that's plant available than there used to be. And we aren't really intentionally applying a lot of fertilizer to our forest ecosystems, but we are burning a ton of fossil fuels in this region. And the resulting emissions include reactive nitrogen compounds that effectively fertilize the forests that are around where those fossil fuels are being burnt. And they fertilize those forest ecosystems through increasing atmospheric nitrogen depositions that fall back or rain back down onto those ecosystems. So here we're looking at a map of atmospheric nitrogen deposition across the US, where redder is more. And we are in a pretty big hotspot here in the Ohio Valley area for nitrogen deposition onto our ecosystems. And this is kind of an aside, maybe you guys have heard about this before, but in addition to depositing plant nutrients on ecosystems, the emissions from fossil fuel burning also lead to acid rain, where the most acidic rain ever recorded in the US fell here in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1979 with a pH of 1.5, which is super duper low, just like really, really acidic, which is really crazy. And the Clean Air Act and its following amendments kind of limited what could be emitted and what would be added to the atmosphere. And fortunately, those are pretty effective, so we don't really experience things like this anymore, which is great. But back to forest carbon. So nitrogen deposition fertilizes ecosystems, and like your house plant, when you put a lot of fertilizer on it and it grows better, this has a really big effect on forest carbon cycling. So here, some researchers synthesized the results of nitrogen fertilization experiments to see how they impacted carbon inputs to the ecosystem and plant photosynthesis, as well as how they impact the carbon pools and vegetation in soil and carbon losses from the ecosystem through respiration. So if something is to the left of this line, it means that fertilization reduced that. And if it's on the right, it increased fertilization. And some of the main impacts of fertilization include an increase in tree carbon and soil carbon. So both of our soil main carbon pools and forests increase in nitrogen deposition. And we have a decline in carbon losses through our soil carbon dioxide efflux, or microbial respiration from solids. So increase in forest carbon under nitrogen deposition is typically what we observe this, which, that kind of makes sense. And now I want to take a look at a very specific fertilization experiment. This is at the Fresno Experimental Forest, which is in Tucker County, West Virginia. So here we artificially manipulated fertilization over an entire watershed. They took a helicopter and they dumped nitrogen inputs on this entire forest for about 30 years. And our forests are a mix of AM and ECM associated stands, so we can leverage data from this experiment to see if these systems differ and how they respond to nitrogen deposition and increased nitrogen availability. And that is what my colleague, Dr. Joe Carrera, did, who's pictured here. He investigated this when he was a Ph.D. student at WVU. Joe performed research where he looked at differences between AM and ECM associated plots in fertilized watershed as well as an unfertilized reference watershed in West Virginia. And here we're looking at some of his data on root biomass. So we have AM plots are the two on the left, and the ECM plots are the two on the right. And that is for the reference or the unfertilized watershed, which is in white, and the watershed that has nitrogen additions in the black. And so what Joe observed is that forest plots that had AM-associated trees had a significant decline in root biomass with nitrogen fertilization, while the ECM plots had a smaller effect. So this suggests that AM trees are better able to acquire nitrogen. They don't have to spend as much plant carbon on making roots to get nitrogen out of the soil as ECM trees do. And then when we look at this across a lot of experiments in a broader area, we see the impacts of a range of nitrogen inputs, which are on the x-axis of these graphs, and how they impact growth of different trees. And we're looking at this one on the far left is the growth of AM trees that increases with nitrogen deposition, while the growth of ECM trees, which is in the middle, kind of peaks a little earlier, like a little nitrogen deposition is good for them, but that growth ultimately declines with more nitrogen inputs. So we have kind of this big effect where these AM-associated trees can really respond to this increased inorganic nitrogen availability that we get from burning fossil fuels and having this nitrogen deposition, whereas the ECM trees aren't as good at maintaining that productivity. So AM or ECM, AM forests are a little better at ECM forests in that regards. But the Clean Air Act helped reduce nitrogen emissions and acid rain. And over the last 2 decades, nitrogen inputs have declined. So where we used to be really red in West Virginia, I don't know if you can see that, we're pretty small there, but now we're completely green pretty much. So that's really great. Like, you know, we're doing a good job with the Clean Air Act and emissions standards. We're not getting 1.5 pH acid rain drought on us. But we don't yet know if our forests can continue to store carbon and continue to be productive and, you know, help serve this important function on the planet with fewer nitrogen inputs. And we also don't know if this increase in carbon that we got during, you know, heavy periods of nitrogen deposition, if that is going to be retained in the future, especially under things like elevated temperatures that increase respiration. And so, I circled West Virginia there. So there is pretty red, and over there it's pretty green. And to address this uncertainty, my colleague Mel is currently conducting an experiment where she's measuring the temperature sensitivity of soils that were from the fertilized watershed of the Furneaux and from the ones that had less nitrogen inputs. So she's incubating jars of soil in the lab and measuring their respiration from the soil. And so far she's observing that soil carbon from the fertilized watershed, which is in green in this graph, is a lot more sensitive to temperature, and so soil CO2 losses increase more with elevated temperatures compared to CO2 losses that were from soils that hadn't been fertilized. And we're kind of in the middle of this experiment. She's got 12 weeks of measurements that she's doing, and we're in week 5, so we'll see if this holds up, but so far, that's where we're at. And now we're going to move on to elevated CO2. So obviously one of these main things that we're predicting as a result of climate change is an increase in atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So here we're looking at projections of atmospheric CO2 under lots of different potential emissions scenarios, which are these different color lines, over the next century up to year 2100 along that x-axis. And with the exception of that dark blue low emissions option, it also seems pretty likely that we're going to be faced with elevated CO2 levels. And this is really important for forest carbon because CO2 is the substrate that plants use in photosynthesis. So it controls that carbon flux that goes into ecosystems. In this experiment, researchers looked at a range of CO2 on the bottom and how that impacted plant photosynthesis rates on the y-axis. And there's a pretty clear positive relationship here. So this is kind of known as the CO2 fertilization effect. So kind of like if you fertilize your plants and it increased growth, now you've added more CO2, more of this substrate for photosynthesis, and it increases photosynthesis rates. And this is more of a theoretical relationship, but I do want to point out here that if we look at our photosynthesis rates, that would be what we would observe at pre-industrial CO2 levels that were under 300 ppms, and now we're up at 424. This has a pretty substantial impact on our potential for photosynthesis to occur and our potential maximum photosynthetic rate, which controls that carbon into ecosystems and controls forest carbon uptake. So elevated CO2 increases forest carbon. But now we're going to take a look at this outside of the lab and outside of theoretical conditions in the field. So to look at CO2 fertilization, there have been a bunch of experiments where this effect has been simulated by pumping CO2 into the air in forest plots. So these are called free air CO2 enrichment, or FACE experiments. Here we're looking at one that was installed in a pine forest on the left, which is ECM associated. That's at Duke in North Carolina. And then the one on the right was installed in a sweet gum forest, which is AM-associated trees, and that was at Oak Ridge National Lab in Tennessee. So earlier we talked about findings that AM-associated trees were better at acquiring plant-available nutrients, and ECM trees could mine organic matter, increase decomposition, and kind of actively acquire the nutrients they need to grow. And under elevated CO2, because these trees could increase their nitrogen availability by stimulating decomposition themselves, they could maintain enhanced productivity, whereas the AM-associated trees became more and more nitrogen limited. So we're pumping CO2 in, but what they need to grow is nitrogen, so they can't take advantage of that elevated CO2 as much over time, which is called progressive nitrogen limitation. And then we synthesize this pattern over a really broad range of studies. This study is looking at all AM and ECM associated forests, and whether or not they maintain this pattern, and they do. So here we're looking at the effect of CO2 on plant pools, which are green, and soil pools, which are yellow, for AM forests, which are on the left, and ECM forests, which are on the right. So we look just at the green right now. We're looking at plant carbon uptake and how it is affected by CO2 levels. So here we see that ECM trees on the right, that green is a lot higher, and so these trees are a lot more responsive to elevated CO2 and they can increase their carbon uptake more. However, when we look at the soils, which are in yellow, we see that AM forests lead to an increase in soil carbon under elevated CO2, whereas ECM forests lead to a loss in soil carbon, probably because they're stimulating soil decomposition, acquiring more nutrients, leading to more decomposition and more carbon losses from the soil. So overall, the net effect on elevated CO2 seems to be stronger for ECM than AM trees because they can, maintain growth. But when we consider the plant and the soil as well, those systems are kind of similar from those experiments. And these are all those experiments that are isolated, more or less, like just elevated CO2 or just nitrogen deposition. But we are going to experience probably all these things together at the same time. And that is really hard to do in an ecosystem in a forest, to simulate all these different things at once. And they're definitely going to occur over the next century. So one thing that we use to this is predictive modeling. So we can take our findings from these experiments, we can put them into models that simulate ecosystems and can predict how they'll respond to multiple factors at the same time and see what they're sensitive to. And our model projections of the future land carbon sink are super uncertain. So here we are looking at the average model projections of either a land carbon sink, which would be above zero, which is that line in the middle here, or a land carbon loss and more carbon that feeds back to climate change and increases atmospheric carbon dioxide on the bottom. So first, we're going to look at in these black projections. So these are projections of the land carbon sink that have changes like temperature and elevated CO2 up to around year 2100. So those predictions go up. So we're like, okay, we're predicting a net carbon sink, but then when we incorporate processes like increased nitrogen limitation that inhibits photosynthetic uptake in forests over time, we get a decline in these projections of the land carbon sink. But I want to point out that all of these projections are uncertain, and we can see within these ranges that we are predicting the potential for an increase in carbon or a decrease in carbon with all of them. And there's a lot of different research, like what we talked about today, that's really critical to continue doing and to try to tighten up these predictions and get a better idea of how forests will feed back to climate change in the future. So I didn't really want to end on uncertainty, but there is a lot of uncertainty, and it's a really important question, and a lot of research is going on to see if there's a tipping point, if there's a point at which forests might stop sequestering carbon and start emitting carbon, or if we can continue to rely on them in the future. But I don't want to end on uncertainty, so I did want to include this graph here, which is looking at carbon storage across the world and all the different biomes. And the top 3 biomes for carbon storage are forests, forests, and more forests. And without forests, we would be in a worse place. So of all the ecosystems on Earth, I think that forests are probably the most vital to protect. They're my favorites anyway. And with that, I'd like to thank you guys all so much for listening. And I did not present any of my own research today, so I really should acknowledge lots of other scientists. There's probably hundreds of people working on experiments like this, trying to figure out what controls carbon uptake by ecosystems, and trying to predict whether or not we can rely on that in the future. So yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, do you guys have any questions for me? What's up?
So a lot of airlines claim that they're going to be carbon neutral, and they say that they do this by buying carbon offsets in terms of planting trees in various forests.
Yeah.
I just wondered if your opinion is that this is primarily greenwashing because forests take a long time to grow, and a lot of places are subject to forest fires, or do you see that carbon reforestation as meaningful way of providing carbon offsets?
So I definitely think that reforestation can be valuable. I think that actually Dr. Brostek next week is really going to go into managing ecosystems to retain carbon and whether or not that is really beneficial or not. And I think that reforestation can be really great, especially on lands that have been impacted or like, you know, a lot of land use change has deforested, and that leads to a huge carbon loss from that ecosystem. So there is the potential to gain carbon through forestation. But unfortunately, reforestation can come nowhere near close enough to compensate for, you know, things that we should be doing instead, like cutting emissions. So that's not a super satisfactory answer to a yes or no question, but yeah, overall good, but not good enough, I guess. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. What's up?
How did you get started on learning about this stuff? Why did you like this?
So I worked for a time at an ecology company that restored mine land sites, and that's actually maybe a point I should make. So we have a lot of sites around here in West Virginia that were mountaintop mined and had, you know, kind of the destruction of forest ecosystems, which gives us a really good potential to build carbon in those ecosystems by restoring the forest that used to be here. And when I was working in that site and doing those jobs, it seemed really fun, like I was helping clean up these ecosystems, and I was an engineer at the time, and it seemed like the scientists were having a lot more fun. Scientists get to find questions and answer them for their job, and that's how I kind of ended up where I'm at studying forests. What's up?
I've been following the work of Olivia Lazard. I don't know if you know her, but she's a climate mitigator. She's the person that actually goes to different countries and tries to settle in a peaceful way any kind of conflicts are based on material resources that we taken out of those areas. She brought up 2 points. In 2020, she mentioned there's an article by I think a group of Brazilian scientists, and they were concerned about the Congo Basin as being so important to providing not only the natural regenerative all we're talking about, but do you think there's a possibility that we should look at the largest protected areas on our planet and protect those first as being the carbon sinks? Like you mentioned how important the land-based carbon sinks are versus the ocean.
Yeah.
Do we look at those hot spots like you showed on your slides on these 2 points? Say those are the most protected areas first, come to some sort of agreement, and then work from there to build our infrastructure out so we're completely along that way. And these places are essentially off limits because we know how regenerative they can be to what we've done to the planet in the first place.
Yeah, so I think it's super critical to protect these ecosystems from a carbon perspective because they're great at storing carbon, but also, you know, from things like a biodiversity perspective, you want to maintain that. You have a lot of like recreation, like forests are really great, but really nothing can hold a candle to reducing emissions as far as like what we should invest efforts into to actively fight climate change. And I think that forests, like protecting forests is a really important part of that strategy. So we're not like, you know, it's not that it is less important, but just that if you're looking at like where should we invest money, I think investing money in cutting emissions is probably the most critical way to address that. And if you're looking at other things, if you're interested in like land use and you know, tourism, or if you're interested in like protecting species habitats, and if you're interested in like uses like hunting, and if you want to maintain these forest carbon sinks, like I think that they can be really powerful. And then Dr. Brostek, of course, next week is going to talk about like specific strategies to increase that carbon sink. But yeah, as far as that goes, cutting emissions is.
Yeah, and I take Olivia Lazard's work pretty seriously because she's concerned how regenerative processes are not even being talked about at the policy level. Like the fact that the idea of forest policy, either locally or just or in the West, especially against those countries in the global South. How that's not even a discussion allow those to regenerate, and that's a big concern. They're not even being discussed. It's almost, yeah, we have reduction models. We know we can do a deep growth at a certain point, but how do we allow the regenerative process to take place without arrogantly meddling into those systems? That's a big concern that I have too. It's more than just like a vehicle. It's the idea of how we
think there's a lot of research that's going on right now into seeing, whether or not we can manage forests or if we should let them do their own thing and if they're better at it on their own. And I don't have the answer to that, but that's super important for sure. Anybody else?
How does West Virginia compare with other states as far as carbon storage?
So West Virginia is really great at carbon storage. We have a lot of trees and we have a lot of forests that were impacted. That gives us the potential to grow and to increase carbon storage, and we have a lower population. So we're doing a great job on that regard because we have a little bit less carbon out, a little fewer emissions from people, and a lot more carbon in because our forests are growing.
With all the emphasis on trees, photosynthesis is photosynthesis. Would an acre of grass be better than an acre that has 10 maple trees on it, as far as surface area, etc.? I mean, I'm all for preserving our forests. What about a field of grass? When you show the Midwest, the grain belt, it's not very productive.
So, I think acre per acre, forests can store a lot more carbon than most grasslands. There's lots of different types of grasslands and crops. So most of my Ph.D. research was in bioenergy agriculture, and we compared like traditional bioenergy crops to ones that are doing a lot better at photosynthesis and can bring in a lot more carbon into ecosystems. And so there is the potential, like within agriculture, for that to happen, but it's pretty rare for grasslands and agriculture to come close to the amount of carbon that trees can photosynthesize.
I do have one more real quick. You brought a good point to your presentation. With the elevation in temperature, overall temperature, we looked at the decaying matter that's already taking place there in fallen trees, what it may. What is the, you mentioned this, the necessity of the thawing effect, that not keeping that at a certain level of temperature and having that carbon release stay organic material. How much of that is a threat as temperature begins to rise?
Yeah, so how vulnerable is our organic matter that's in our soil pool, even if it's a tree log, we usually consider it like that for this kind of thing. It is super, it's a super big thing to look at. That's what my colleague Emil is looking at, looking at temperature sensitivity of the soil carbon, and soils that have more of this carbon that's, I guess, not yet decayed by microbes, that definitely has the potential to be a really strong carbon source to the atmosphere. And where I think we see this a lot is in soils that are like permafrost soils, or soils that are like wetlands that are then, like when they're wetlands, we have really slow decomposition because it's underwater, but then you drain it, and now you have this potential to have this huge carbon flux back to the atmosphere from the decay of that. So that's super important. And I think that's a thing that, when we're thinking about when we're increasing carbon in forests, like, okay, let's try to manage this area to increase carbon. And if we increase soil carbon, like, are we just, is that going to be, can we rely on that to stay there? Or is that going to be respired when temperatures increase in the future? There's a huge potential for that carbon to be lost if we have elevated temperatures. Yes?
If I understand correctly, a lot of the West Virginia forests are second growth, but there are places on the West Coast where there are remaining old growth forests. And as I understand it, the research is mixed about carbon sequestration of old growth forests versus second growth forests. And the timber industries, I know, are making the case that the second growth forests sequester more carbon because they grow more vigorously, and then the older forests become decay. And obviously, it's very, very, very complex. A lot of cherry picking is going on. But I wonder if you had any thoughts on old growth versus second growth sequestration.
I've seen some of those things. I'm definitely not an expert on that as much, but I would not go around cutting down old growth forests. With that being said, timber resources are really important because that's a lot more sustainable than doing things like building buildings with concrete and steel. So I think that, some forestry, if it's done effectively, I think that it can be more sustainable when you look at that whole life cycle of it. And there is some truth that these newer forests are faster growing and store more carbon. But that's usually just from a tree perspective as well. It doesn't necessarily consider the soil carbon. When you chop all the trees down, you also get a huge loss of that soil carbon back into the atmosphere. And so I would tend to land on the side of, I think the old growth forests are super important. But, you do have to, I think, allow somewhat to have like a timber industry, because we don't want to not have wood buildings and wood things and have all concrete and steel instead. That would be worse. So. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much.
Well,